Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway station, which was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear. They were waiting for their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown caught sight of him sitting on an old suitcase behind a pile of mailbags. As they drew near, he stood up and politely raised his hat. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you?" "Well, no," said Mr. Brown. "We were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" "Darkest Peru," said the bear. "I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway. I came all the way in a lifeboat, and I ate marmalade. Bears like marmalade. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy, but she had to go into a home for retired bears, so I emigrated." "Oh." "Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to emigrate when I was old enough, but now that I have, I'm not quite sure what to do next." As he bent down, the Browns caught sight of a label round his neck. It said, "Please look after this bear, thank you." It was the kind of label you couldn't possibly ignore, and in no time at all things began to happen. Mrs. Brown thought of a name for him. Paddington. And while she went off to look for Judy, Mr. Brown was put in charge of ordering some refreshments. Paddington. Paddington. "Come along, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "I expect you're hungry after your long journey." "I am," said Paddington. "Very." Paddington had never been taken out to tea before, and he was very excited. "I don't suppose there are many bears who've been inside a buffet, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. No," said Mr. Brown. Especially one with buns." "I think perhaps I'd better sit down." Yes," said Mr. Brown, trying hard to pretend that he had tea with a bear every day of his life. "Hello, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington as he caught sight of the others. "Don't go away. We're in here." "Watch out," shouted Mr. Brown. But he was too late. Paddington was already up to his knees in trouble. "Henry," cried Mrs. Brown, "what are you doing?" "What am I doing?" "Look at him. He's all covered in jam and cream. I've never seen such a mess. I don't know what the manageress will say." "Or the taxi driver," said Judy. "Taxi driver?" "Judy's right," said Mrs. Brown. "We can't leave him here, not in his present state." "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington. "I'll clear up the mess. Bears are good at clearing up messes." "Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please, as quickly as you can." "Not too quickly," called Mrs. Brown. "We've 2 more to come." "Is that one of them?" asked the driver. "He's covered in white stuff." "It's only cream," said Judy. "I dare say," said the driver. "But bears is 6pence extra. Sticky bears is 9pence. 9pence extra!" exclaimed Paddington hotly. He directed a hard stare at the driver. He seemed to go a funny shade of pink. "Gosh," said Judy, "how did you learn to do that?" "My Aunt Lucy taught me," said Paddington. "She said it might come in useful one day." "Mary," said Mr. Brown, "are you sure we're doing the right thing?" "That," said Mrs. Brown, "remains to be seen. I've never had a bear about the house before, but I have a feeling things may never be quite the same again." When Paddington arrived at number 32 Windsor Gardens, the first person he met was the Browns' housekeeper. Mrs. Bird. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm from darkest Peru, and I've come to stay." "Peru!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "Good gracious, whatever next?" "Don't worry," called Judy. "He's going to have a bath. Hold on, Paddington, I'm just coming." "Did you say you're from Peru?" called Mrs. Bird. "Darkest Peru," said Paddington. "In that case, I'd best be getting some more marmalade in." "Fancy knowing I like marmalade," exclaimed Paddington. "Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything," said Judy. "She sounds just like Aunt Lucy," said Paddington. The next person Paddington met was Judy's brother Jonathan, and while Jonathan put some bubble mixture into the bath, Paddington listened carefully to his instructions. "There's some soap," said Judy, "and a towel, and a brush so that you can scrub your back." Paddington felt he would sooner just sit in a puddle, but he didn't like to say so. "It sounds very complicated," he announced. "Well," said Judy, "don't forget to wash your ears. They look very black." "Black?" said Paddington hotly. "Black? They're meant to be black. At least, I think they are." For a moment or two, he toyed with the idea of whitening his ears with a toothpaste, but he soon gave that up. There were other, much more interesting things to do. "What was that?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "Perhaps it was Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "Bang went our tea by the sound of it." Unaware of the alarm he was causing, Paddington busied himself making a foam map of South America. Some of the mountains were very high indeed, and he was about to mark in darkest Peru when he suddenly remembered the bath. "What is going on?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "Don't tell me Mrs. Bird's fallen in the washing-up water now." "That's funny," said Jonathan. "Talking of water—" "Gosh!" cried Judy. "Look!" "Paddington, he's in trouble." To say that Paddington was in trouble was to put it mildly. He tried calling out, "Help," fairly quietly, so as not to disturb anyone, and then much louder, "Help! Help!" "Paddington," said Judy, "you've still got your duffel coat on." "I didn't want to get too wet," gasped Paddington. "Only I think I have done after all." "Help!" "Why ever didn't you pull the plug out?" exclaimed Jonathan. "Pull the plug out?" repeated Paddington. "Nobody said anything about that." "I shall never, ever have a bath again," he said firmly. "It's much too complicated." But before he went to bed that night, Paddington did have one more go. "It's what's known as a dry bath," he announced. "It's safer than using water, and it's much less messy." The first morning in his new home, Paddington woke to the news that Mrs. Brown and Judy were taking him for a trip on the Underground. There was also a large tray of breakfast things beside his bed. So much seemed to be happening at once, he had a job deciding what to do first. So he started on the bacon. "Hurry up," called Judy. We're going shopping and it's nearly time to leave. Coming, cried Paddington. I've never been on an underground before, he announced. I'm not sure if you'll be going now, said Judy. Not with bacon sticking out of your suitcase like that. Look at it. It's for emergencies, said Paddington. Bears often have emergencies. In fact, I think I've got one coming on now. It's very strange, said Mrs. Brown. I've never heard so many dogs. Perhaps it's the fine weather bringing them out. I don't think it's the weather, Mrs. Brown, gasped Paddington. I think it's my bacon. What's left of it? After the excitement of Windsor Gardens, Paddington found the underground much more to his liking, and he hurried on ahead of the others. Everything seemed to have been thought of. There was a moving staircase, pictures on the wall. There was even a sign with his name on, showing which way to go. Paddington, cried Judy, you're going the wrong way. But it was too late. By the time he'd realized his mistake, Paddington was at the top of the stairs again. Here, said the ticket collector. What's all this? You haven't been anywhere yet? I think I must have made a mistake at the bottom, said Paddington. Bert, called the collector, there's a young bear here smelling of bacon. Says he's made a mistake at the bottom. I'm sorry, said Paddington. I'm not used to escalators. We don't have any in darkest Peru. Darkest Peru, repeated the inspector. Oh, well, in that case, you'd better get back down, but don't let me catch you up to any more tricks. You're worse than them dogs. Shoo, go away. There he goes again, cried Judy. Do something, Paddington. That, said Mrs. Brown, was a dangerous thing to say. I think he's done it. You again? Said the inspector. I'll have you know escalators is for the convenience of passengers, not for the likes of young bears to play on. It doesn't seem very convenient to me, said Paddington. I've been here ages and I haven't got anywhere yet. We're supposed to be going shopping, said Mrs. Brown. That's as may be, said the inspector sternly, but pressing the escalator stop button without a very good reason is against the rules. Persons are expected to abide by the rules. Did you say persons? Asked Judy. That's right, and I've got my job to do. It's bad enough being pestered by dogs. Well, Paddington's not a person, said Judy. He's a bear. Isn't that lucky? Said the inspector. Well, don't let it happen again. I think you're a very kind inspector, said Judy. Don't you, Paddington? Very, agreed Paddington. In fact, he announced, I shall always travel from here in future. It's a very good station if you don't want to go anywhere, especially if you have an emergency on the way. Paddington had never been shopping in London before, especially at a store like Barkridge's. Equally, Barkridge's had never had a customer quite like Paddington, especially in the gentleman's outfitting department. We would like some bear's pyjamas, please, said Mrs. Brown. Bear's pyjamas, repeated the assistant. Has Madam tried something in government surplus? Indeed not, said Mrs. Brown. I've never heard anything like it. Have you, Paddington? Never, said Paddington hotly, and he gave the man one of his special hard stares. Yes, sir, said the assistant. At once, sir. He's been sleeping in his duffel coat, explained Mrs. Brown, and we don't want that. "We certainly don't," agreed the assistant. "Would the young gentleman care for something in stripes? They're all the rage just now." "I'd sooner have something in spots," said Paddington. "If I had a pair like these, I don't think I would ever get lost, not even if I fell out of bed by mistake." "You can say that again," murmured Judy. "The changing rooms are on the right," called the assistant. "Don't go wrong." "I do hope they fit," said Mrs. Brown. "He'll be most disappointed if they don't." "So shall we all, madam," said the assistant. So far, pyjama week at Barkridge's had been a disaster. In fact, Paddington was the first customer they'd had for days. But if Barkridge's were unhappy about their pyjamas, Paddington was even more upset by the state of their changing rooms. As far as he could make out, most of the doors were locked, and when he did find one which opened, he practically had to force his way through. On the other hand, once inside, it was all very different. It was more like the inside of a house, and he was most impressed. Paddington wasn't sure how long he slept, but he was suddenly woken by a very strange noise. It sounded just like rain, but as he looked out of the window, he had yet another shock. "Well," said a voice behind him, "what are you doing in our shop window, Bear?" "Your shop window?" repeated Paddington. He suddenly wished he hadn't bought such loud pyjamas. "Oh dear," he announced to the world in general, "I think I've been recognized." But to his surprise, the manager of Barkridge's was more than delighted with all that had happened. "Bear," he boomed, "you're what we in the trade call a trend-setter. Since you went to bed in our shop window, those pyjamas have been selling like hot cakes. Look at them. They've all gone." And to show just how pleased he was, he offered Paddington anything he liked to choose in the store as a present. Paddington licked his lips. All the excitement had made him feel hungry, and he was tempted to ask for one of the hot cakes the manager had mentioned. Then he caught sight of the very thing, some Wellington boots. "I'd like a pair of these, please," he announced. "If it rains the next time I'm in bed, it'll stop the ends of my pyjamas getting soggy. That would never do, especially now you've sold out." One of the things Paddington liked most about living with the Brown family was that he made lots of new friends. The nicest one of all was Mr. Gruber. Mr. Gruber kept an antique shop in the Portobello Road, and most mornings they had their elevenses together. What Mr. Gruber didn't know about antiques wasn't worth knowing, and to enter his shop was like entering another world. So when he arrived one morning and found that his friend appeared to be washing one of his pictures, he was most surprised. "Don't worry, Mr. Brown," explained Mr. Gruber. "I'm only restoring it." "So?" Paddington looked at it doubtfully. "It doesn't seem to be one thing or the other, Mr. Gruber," he said. "Ah," said Mr. Gruber. "There's more in paintings than meets the eye." You see, in the old days, Mr. Brown, artists were often so poor they had to do their paintings on top of old canvases. Sometimes, if you clean a painting, you find a much more valuable one underneath. Do you realize, Mr. Brown, this could be an old master? It looks more like an old mistress to me, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. Paddington turned the matter over in his mind all the way home, and by the time he reached number 32 Windsor Gardens, he was very thoughtful indeed. Mr. Brown had lots of pictures, and one of them had been standing in the front room for several days now, doing absolutely nothing. I think, he announced to the world in general, I may try restoring it for him. I expect he'll like that. Paddington had a hopeful nature, but as time went on, he began to get a bit worried. Far from being restored, Mr. Brown's picture looked as if it would never be quite the same again. Worse still, there was no sign of another painting underneath. It was, to say the least of it, a mess. It was only when he tried turning it round the other way that he discovered there was a label on the back. It said, "Property of Mr. Henry Brown, entry for the Portobello Road Art Society painting competition, to be collected." Mr. Brown's painting had started out as a study of some boats on a lake. Now it looked more like a storm at sea. Even with real paints, Paddington wouldn't have fancied his chances of repairing the damage, but with only tomato sauce and marmalade to work with, he had a nasty feeling there might well be an even bigger storm before the day was out. Paddington went to bed early that afternoon, suffering from a mysterious attack of something called restoritis. It was a most unusual complaint, which had caused him to come out in red and orange spots. If they looked suspiciously like tomato sauce and marmalade stains, he managed to hide the fact behind a large bowl of calves' foot jelly, Mrs. Bird's recipe for all ills. It wasn't until much later on, when he heard a strange voice downstairs, that he decided to put in an appearance again. "Remarkable use of colour," said the voice. "Most unusual, using marmalade chunks instead of paint." To Paddington's surprise, Mr. Brown's picture was occupying a position of honour in the middle of the room, and on the frame there was a large red rosette. "That means it's won first prize," explained Judy. "I didn't know you painted abstracts, Dad," said Jonathan. "I don't," said Mr. Brown, "but I'd like to abstract an answer from whoever did do it." "I was really looking for an old master, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, "but I'm afraid it went wrong." "It looks more like a young bear to me," said the judge. "And I'll say one thing, it not only looks good, it tastes good as well. Try some." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, "but I think you'll find it tastes even nicer if you stand it the right way up." Soon after Paddington went to live at number 32 Windsor Gardens, Mr. Brown decided to decorate the attic so that he could have a room of his own. But like most of his jobs, it got left half done, until one morning Paddington decided it was high time he stirred things up a bit. Paddington wasn't sure how long it took him to do the wallpapering, but he did discover one thing. Apart from making him hot, it also showed up the ceiling. The ceiling definitely needed whitewashing. "Is that you, Paddington?" shouted Mr. Brown. "Are you all right?" cried Mrs. Brown. "Yes and no," answered Paddington truthfully. The plain fact was that when he'd started work there had been a window and a door. Now there was only a window left. "Perhaps you'd better let yourselves in," he exclaimed, "wherever you are. I think I must have papered myself in by mistake." Paddington expected to be in trouble, but when he was writing his adventure down in his scrapbook that night, he suddenly found himself with several extra lots of bun money. Mrs. Brown gave him some because at long last they had to have a real decorator in. And Mr. Brown's was because he hadn't wanted to do the job anyway. "Bears," said Mrs. Bird, "always fall on their feet." "Perhaps you'd like me to decorate your kitchen for you, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington hopefully. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Bird, and she gave Paddington a little extra something too, just to make sure he didn't. One day, Paddington bought himself a camera in the market. It had a tripod, and a hood to keep out the light, and there was even a book of instructions. Altogether, it seemed very good value indeed. So after taking a quick bite of a marmalade sandwich, he got ready to take his first picture. There was a very interesting chapter in the instruction book on taking action shots. But it wasn't as easy as it sounded. In the end, he decided to take a family group. It seemed much safer. "I hope he's not long," said Mr. Brown. "I've got cramp coming on." "I wouldn't move if I were you," said Jonathan. "We'd never hear the last of it," agreed Judy. "He's only got one plate." "I've only got one leg," groaned Mr. Brown. "Shh, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "I think he's doing something." Paddington consulted his instruction book. "I have to measure the distance," he announced. "I'll use this piece of string. If I don't measure the distance properly, I shan't know how far away you are, and you may come out all blurred." "I'd sooner be blurred than have my ear pulled off," grumbled Mr. Brown. "I'm afraid bears' slip knots are a bit hard to untie," said Paddington. Anyway, I think I shall have to ask you all to move. The sun's in a different place. Perhaps if one of us took it, said Mrs. Bird, you could be in the picture yourself. Paddington considered the matter over a marmalade sandwich. I shall press the shutter, he announced, and then run round the front. Even bears can't run that fast, murmured Mr. Brown. Paddington gave Mr. Brown a hard stare through his lens. But as he did so, something very strange happened. What on earth's he up to now? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. He looks as if he's practicing for the ballet or something. Mind my petunias. Too late, groaned Jonathan. Are you all right? Called Mrs. Brown. I think so, Mrs. Brown, said Paddington, except I've pressed the shutter by mistake. I'm afraid I've been having trouble with a bumblebee again. It must have been after my marmalade sandwich. Perhaps I'd better finish it before anything else happens. No one, least of all Paddington, expected his photograph to come out. But to everyone's surprise, when the plate was developed and printed, there was quite a clear picture. Not bad, said Mr. Brown. Not bad at all. What is it? Take a look in my window, said the man. Paddington hurried outside in order to see for himself. Apart from his photograph, there was a label. It said, "Picture of a bumblebee, taken by local bear, both very rare." One day, Mr. Gruber took Paddington on an outing to an auction sale. He bought a catalogue of the items to be sold and then found a seat near the front so that they would have a good view of all that went on. Paddington decided straight away that he liked auction sales. It was all very friendly. In fact, he hardly had time to sit down before someone waved. So he waved back. Then another man waved. So he waved at him too, and then raised his hat several more times for good measure.
£4 on bid. £5 over there.
Going, called the auctioneer, pointing at Paddington. Going, gone. But I've only just got here, exclaimed Paddington. Don't worry, said Mr. Gruber. That's the auctioneer. He's just sold something. Paddington gave the man a hard stare. I hope it's not that table, he exclaimed. It must be full of dents by now. Lot 65, one carpentry set, sold to the young bear with the sandwiches for £5. £5? Exclaimed Paddington. For a carpentry set? But I've only got 10p. Mr. Gruber reached for his wallet. I expect it was because you waved, Mr. Brown, he whispered. You see, if you nod your head or even scratch your nose at an auction sale, they often think it's a sign you're interested. Paddington sat very still, hardly daring to breathe, let alone nibble his sandwich, in case he bought something else by mistake. What am I bid for this old highwayman's pistol? Called the auctioneer. Once the property of Dick Turpin. I think I might try for that, whispered Mr. Gruber. I've been after one for ages. Come along, who's going to start the bidding? £10, called someone at the back of the hall. 11, called Mr. Gruber. 12, shouted the other man. Oh, dear, said Mr. Gruber. I hope I don't lose it, Mr. Brown. £13. 14, shouted Paddington. Any advance on £14? 15, shouted Paddington wildly. £15, called the auctioneer. Going, gone. Sold to the young bear gentleman on my right. Mr. Gruber began to feel that perhaps taking Paddington to an auction sale wasn't such a good thing after all. "Perhaps I'd better not do any more bidding, Mr. Gruber," began Paddington. "I don't think bears are very good at it."
Lot 67, a very unusual marmalade stand.
Paddington hastily changed his mind. "I'd like one of those," he exclaimed excitedly. "Mrs. Bird's always grumbling because my jars get sticky."
What am I bid for this fine piece of antique silver?
5pence, cried Paddington excitedly.
5pence, repeated the auctioneer. Did I hear someone say 5pence?
6pence, said Paddington.
If you ask me, said a voice, that young bear knows something we don't.
Perhaps it's a fake, said another. No one would bid 6pence if it were a real silver stand.
Going, said the auctioneer desperately. Is that all I'm bid? Will no one make an advance on 6pence? Going, gone.
"And a very good buy indeed, Mr. Brown," said Mr. Gruber later that day. "It more than makes up for the money we lost on your carpentry set and the pistol." "It more than makes up for missing our 11s too, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington happily. "Besides, I think marmalade tastes even better when it comes out of an antique, especially when it's a 6penny one." One morning, Paddington was having breakfast in bed when he came across a very interesting article in one of his magazines. It was called "Delight Your Family and Surprise Your Friends," and it showed how to make a magazine rack. All you needed was a sheet of plywood, a hammer, a saw, and a few nails. It sounded very good value indeed. One thing the article hadn't mentioned was how to carry a sheet of plywood and a box of tools at the same time. If it had, he might not have bumped into the Browns' neighbour, Mr. Curry.
"Bear!" bellowed Mr. Curry. "What are you doing, Bear?"
"Do it yourself, Mr. Curry," said Paddington.
"What's that? How dare you?"
"Oh, no, Mr. Curry. I didn't mean you were to do it yourself. I meant I'm going to do it myself. I'm making a magazine rack. Look."
"Magazine rack? Yeah, I'd like a magazine rack, Bear. I'm going out now, so you can use my kitchen table to work on, but don't make too much mess. I don't like messes. If you have it ready for me by the time I get back, I may not report you for banging my nose just now."
"Thank you very much, Mr. Curry." Paddington had never actually sawn anything in two before, and he soon discovered it wasn't as easy as it looked. In fact, it got harder and harder. It wasn't until he sat down for a much-needed rest that he discovered why. Mr. Curry now had two small tables with only 2 legs each, instead of one large table with 4 legs. It was really almost beyond repair. Even covering the join with marmalade and drawing the blind couldn't disguise the fact that it was also very wobbly. Paddington decided he had an emergency on his paws. But when he stood up in order to survey his handiwork, he had yet another shock. Mr. Curry's table seemed to have shrunk, In fact, he couldn't remember ever having seen such a short table before. "Delight your family and surprise your friends," he said bitterly. Paddington was quite sure Mr. Curry would be surprised when he saw what was left of his table, but as for delighting the Browns with a magazine rack, that seemed very far away. Mrs. Bird, however, was delighted with what he'd made them. "Most useful," she said. "And how thoughtful to make two," agreed Mrs. Brown. Yes," said Paddington, "but I'm afraid they're not both for you. This one is really Mr. Curry's, but I'm not giving it to him yet. I shall leave it on his doorstep after dark." "After dark?" repeated Judy. "Whatever for?" "I can guess," said Jonathan. "Look out of the window."
Bear!
roared Mr. Curry. "Well, Paddington, perhaps I'd better make Mr. Curry a present of my tools as well," said Paddington. "I don't think I shall be doing it myself again for a long time." "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Paddington, "my next trick is impossible. At least, that's what it says in my instructions."
But you haven't done one yet,
called Mr. Curry.
You can't have a next trick if you haven't done a first one.
"For this trick," said Paddington, ignoring the interruption, "I shall require an egg." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bird. "Can't you use something else?" "No," said Paddington firmly. "It definitely says an egg. I'm going to turn it into a bunch of flowers. If I can get my wand to work."
"I'd sooner you turned it into an omelette," said Mr. Curry. "I'm hungry."
Paddington gave the Brown's neighbour a hard stare. Mr. Curry had invited himself to the party, and the general feeling was that he'd only come for the free tea. The conjuring outfit was a birthday present from all the Brown family, and Paddington was having enough trouble as it was without Mr. Curry's interruptions. "I think it's disgusting," hissed Mrs. Brown, "coming to take the crumbs off a young bear's plate. He'll be lucky if he gets any crumbs off Paddington's plate." Paddington placed the egg carefully on the table and covered it with a handkerchief. "I shall now say the magic words," he announced. "Abracadabra. Hey presto." "Bravo!" called Mr. Gruber.
"Very good," remarked Mr. Curry grudgingly. "All done by sleight of paw, of course, but very good for a bear."
"What's he doing with my daffodils?" asked Mr. Brown. "Shh, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "I think he's about to do another trick."
"Well, I wish he'd hurry up," snorted Mr. Curry. "I shall have another biscuit while I'm waiting."
Do you think young Mr. Brown's all right?" asked Mr. Gruber. "He's been gone rather a long time." "No," cried Paddington, "I'm not. It's all dark and I can't read my instructions. I think I'd better try my watch trick instead."
"Good," said Mr. Curry. "I'm fed up with seeing things disappear."
"Perhaps I could borrow your wristwatch, Mr. Curry." "You did say you wanted to see a new trick," said Judy.
"And you're the only person wearing one."
"Don't worry, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. "It's all in my instructions. Now, I cover it with the handkerchief, so, and I hit it with the hammer." Oh dear.
"Oh, dear? What do you mean, oh, dear? What's gone wrong, Bear?"
Paddington consulted his instructions. As he did so, he saw the ominous words, "For this trick, it is necessary to use a dummy watch." "I think I forgot to say abracadabra, Mr. Curry," he exclaimed.
"Abracadabra! I'll give you abracadabra. That was a very valuable watch. 20 jewels. Shockproof."
"It doesn't look very shockproof to me," said Mr. Brown. "And it's certainly not that valuable," said Mr. Gruber. "I remember selling it to you 5 years ago, and you didn't pay much for it then." I think I found one of the jewels, Mr. Curry, cried Paddington excitedly.
One of the jewels, bellowed Mr. Curry. What about the other 19? I've never been so insulted in my... What's this? I'm sitting on something sticky.
Oh, dear, said Paddington. That's my disappearing egg, Mr. Curry. It must have reappeared. Perhaps, said Mr. Gruber, you ought to disappear for a while, Mr. Brown. And while you're gone, I'll get Mr. Curry another watch. I've a whole box full in my shop. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. That sounds a very good idea. I don't think I shall reappear again for a long time. One morning, Mr. and Mrs. Brown woke feeling ill, so they went straight back to bed again. The trouble was that with Jonathan and Judy at school and Mrs. Bird away on holiday, there was no one left to take care of them. Don't worry, said Paddington. I'll look after you. Bears are good at looking after people. I'll make you a stew. Aunt Lucy always made one when I wasn't well. Oh, dear, groaned Mr. Brown. I think I feel a relapse coming on. Paddington was very keen on cooking. At least, he always felt he would be if he ever got the chance to have a go. And although he'd never actually made a stew before, he'd often watched Mrs. Bird at work. Mrs. Bird made very good stews. If he had any complaints at all, it was that her dumplings were a little on the small side. Paddington decided that his dumplings would be the biggest ever made. Making dumplings was much harder work than Paddington had expected, and what with that and the heat of the kitchen, he soon started to nod off. He wasn't sure how long he slept, but he woke with a nasty feeling that he wasn't alone, and that something was coming nearer and nearer. That's funny, said Mr. Brown. There's a great big white thing suddenly appeared in the rockery. It wasn't there just now. A white thing, Mr. Brown, said Paddington innocently. Perhaps it's a snowball. In midsummer? That bird doesn't seem to think much of it, said Mr. Brown. It's just broken its beak. Oh, dear, said Paddington. In that case, I should hurry up and eat yours before it sets. Before it sets, repeated Mr. Brown. Yes, said Paddington. I'm afraid I've been having trouble with my dumplings, but don't worry. I've got some spare mixture under my... At least, I think if you'll excuse me, I'll just go and put my head under the tap. Put your head under the tap? Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other uneasily. You may want some seconds, explained Paddington, and I wouldn't want to disappoint you. There's nothing worse than being without dumplings, especially when you're ill. One morning, when Mr. and Mrs. Brown were ill in bed, Paddington decided to lend a paw with the washing. In a weak moment, he'd even offered to do some of Mr. Curry's pullovers, which was how the clothes dryer came to collapse under the weight. Paddington decided there was only one way out of the problem. He would have to visit a launderette. Before she went away, Mrs. Bird had left some special instructions for just such an emergency, so he loaded up the wheelbarrow and set off. According to the instructions, the Browns' laundry needed hot water, whereas Mr. Curry's pullovers had to have warm, in case they stretched. So he decided to use two machines. Left paw, hot wash. Right paw, warm wash. Left paw, hot wash. Right paw, warm wash.
Bear, what's going on? What are you doing to my washing?
Oh, Mr. Curry. Nothing, Mr. Curry. That is, Oh, dear.
What's happened to my pullovers? I had 6 white pullovers when you left this morning.
You wouldn't like one large cocoa-coloured one, would you, Mr. Curry? asked Paddington hopefully.
What's that?
Or even a kit of parts for making a new one? Mrs. Bird's got some very good patterns.
Ah, come here, Bear.
Perhaps you'd like a cup of cocoa to be going on with, Mr. Curry. There's lots more where this came from, and it's very frothy.